Welcome to Behind the Sims. At SaberSim, we're a team of professional gamblers, data scientists, and sports nerds building the best DFS optimizer and sports betting model on the market. This podcast is a behind-the-scenes look at how we do it. Every episode is an unedited recording of our team's actual conversations as we research, analyze, and iterate our way to answering the tough questions in DFS and sports betting. Whether we're answering questions like what's the best way to build your bankroll, analyzing different ways to diversify, or even building new models, we're going to share it all right here, and we aren't holding anything back. If you're ready to go deep into what it really takes to win, then this is a podcast for you.
Cool. Okay, so we are back for another Behind the Sims here. Been a couple weeks as we work through the slider backtesting and contest simulation project here. When we last left off, I know that we were pushing through some build speed and infrastructure problems, as well as also trying to get to having some initial findings to look at. So I think excited to chat again here today. Matt, I guess I will just let you maybe get us caught up here before we start diving in.
Yeah, sure. So, it's obviously, it's been a couple weeks, and I think this project has been more difficult than we had hoped, but we're I'm definitely learning a lot. I think we're making some the infrastructure that we've set up, I think we'll be able to use in the future. So I'm hoping it's not just sort of like a lot of wasted time and headache. But yeah, basically there's been a lot of just hurdles that have come up on the DevOps side of getting all the sims running without error, and but we are basically at a point where all the contests and builds and sims are run. It ended up being quite a bit. So I think we have right now about 30 mid 30s slates, so 34 or something slates that we simmed. Each one, some of them only have a handful of contests that we have data for because they're just very small slates. Some of them are big slates where we have 100 contests. So part of the slowness was just it's a lot of contests to sim, because in each of those 100 contests, we're simulating about 2,000 builds, because it's each combination of the slider settings, which go from 1 to or 0 to 10, so 11 different combinations. But then as the sim variance or sim precision gets higher, we run multiple builds. So for 8 through 10, we'll run 3 builds. For 6 through or 5 through 7 or whatever, we'll run 2. So yeah, it ends up being 2,100 builds times between 5 to 100 contests per slate times 34. So I think it ended up being millions, 3 million contest sims, which is kind of wild. So basically that finished up earlier this week, and Elijah has basically been starting to gather the data. The other difficulty is we're storing all this data on on our just kind of cloud file storage essentially, but then actually downloading all of it was another DevOps thing, because it's each build basically was a separate file, which I think I realized that I should have been more intentional about how to structure all this data. We wanted to kind of store it piecemeal, so that if something broke, we didn't lose all of it, but then that means we have to download each file separately. So anyway, that's all kind of boring DevOps troubleshooting that we're basically over. So Elijah has the data now, but we've been kind of chatting a little bit the past few days about some weirdness in it. So I think I'll pass it off to you, Elijah, and just see what have you found so far? And I know that there's some issues that you've seen, so we can just sort of chat through those.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I mean, yeah, I'm also surprised how many hurdles that we ran into on the DevOps side of things. But I'm excited Matt got everything on the cloud, and now okay, we thought that was the finish line, but now getting it down was another nightmare. But the good news is we got kind of scrappy with it and found some ways to download a lot of the data. I think I have about 30% of whatever's on the cloud on my local machine now. So I thought that would be enough to kind of get going with it. You said there was like around 3 million something. I was going to ask you this morning about that.
I think it was something like that from when I saw
I think I have like 1.2 million locally on my computer. So like I figured that'd be enough to
for sure
start to do some stuff. And so I guess I ran some like initial just like smoke tests to see if this data makes sense and stuff. And I think 2 pretty weird things came up that I wanted to like talk about with you guys, and maybe we could figure out like what the source of that is. So like one, which I'm not super concerned about, but there's a pretty significant amount of negative 100% ROI builds. And Matt, I remember we spoke how we thought those were like qualifiers because like there's not actually like cash prize, but it's like I filtered for GPPs, for only GPPs in the data, and I was still seeing negative 100. So I dug into like what those contests were, and they were like 3-person single entries. Does that make sense in a 5,000 sims for there to be always a loss? Like what does that mean to you? Okay,
no,
so that's an issue. Okay.
So probably, so just to clarify, I think that the way that the contests are classified is they can be qualifiers and GPPs, unless you like specifically filtered for like the qualifier flag as being false.
That's what I did.
You did? Okay.
Yeah, I did. So I did no cash, like because we flag for cash and qualifiers, and
in that case, I think the other thing that could be happening is there's some weirdness with how when we download the data from DraftKings, like we have like the CSV. When you go on DraftKings to like the contest history, you can download the contest CSV. For some reason, sometimes they include they include the correct like accented characters for the player names, and sometimes they just have like question marks where there should be. So like Ronald Acuna, like there's supposed to be like an accent, and then there's just like it's just a question mark. And so I actually did fix that, but I think that there might be some like old data from before. I think basically I just set up like a kind of name matching where we would just like try to find the best match, and that should work in most cases, where it's like, okay, all the characters are the same except for this weird question mark. But I think there might be some old data where like it's a 3-man contest, and like all of the entries have like these players that we can't recognize, and so we essentially are saying, I mean, in that case, you'd think it would be like plus like infinite ROI because you always win, but it might be something about that. I mean, if you have like a specific example contest, I can like quickly look at it and see.
Yeah, let me see. It's funny, the kernel that I'm running this thing keeps crashing, so I'm scared to run it again right now because there's just so much data in there. But I was printing out those contest IDs, and I ran some queries to see like what those contests look like that are all getting negative 100, and all of them are 3 or 4 entries total, every single one.
Okay,
there's not a single one that's not 3 or 4. So I don't know if that like helps understand what's going on here. But like, is it possible like you didn't do that player matching for contest size that were under 4 people, or was that not like a?
I don't think there's a query specifically for that. I mean, I guess like my inclination would be like, let's just skip those contests.
That's what I was going to say.
So I dropped them. That was I did drop them from this analysis because I was like, I imagine there's something weird here. Let's just drop these. So that's what I did. But
and really, like, I think the common like advice is just play your cash. Like that's generally just like a cash. I mean, I think you probably shouldn't. If my intuition is that like there's probably edge in not playing your cash lineup in those contests, but I think 99% of people play their cash lineup in those contests. Regardless, I don't think it's like a priority to analyze them, and clearly if there's some issue there, then it's not worth it. The only caveat is like if that is an issue that's affecting other contests as well, and it's just not as obvious, I do want to know what's happening, because like maybe like we only are noticing those because like it's negative 100, but like maybe that same issue is affecting like some percentage of the entries in other contests, and like that's going to be affecting all of the numbers. So I think we
Sure.
should try to get to the bottom of it. It doesn't have to be right now, but
Mhm.
for now, I would probably just ignore those. But we
Yeah,
should dig in and just see like what's going on there.
for sure.
Yeah,
I
I
was
think
happy to just drop them. Sorry, go on, Jordan.
no, yeah, I was just gonna say, like, kind of on the DFS side, I feel like the optimal strategy for anything smaller than like 10 entrants is kind of beyond sliders anyway. Like, I think
Yeah.
people that are playing those at a super high level are probably doing a lot of like looking at the lineups that other people in the contest have as games
Yeah.
lock and then adjusting. Like,
I think there's huge edge there. I know that some of like the other popular DFS podcasts have talked a little bit about those types of contests, and like
yeah,
because there are these like not whales or sharks or whatever. There's these super high volume players that are just putting the same lineup in like every single contest there, and they're not
Mhm.
paying attention. And if you like actually put work into it and like actively try to not dupe, then you can essentially like if like everybody, say there's a 5-man contest. I know we're getting off topic, but say there's like 5-man contests and like 4 of the lineups like share 6 of the same 8 players,
Mhm.
then like especially for MLB, if you like just differentiate from that,
Right.
even if you're not just duping, but if you differentiate, then like you can essentially make that contest like a 50-50 where it's like, okay, just like fade most of those players. And then like if they don't do well, like there's just a lot of game theory opportunity, I think, for like to kind of taking advantage of the fact that like all of the lineups are so similar.
Right.
Where,
Yeah, you're getting like
yeah,
5-1 in a pseudo 50-50, basically.
right. So anyway, that's obviously off topic, but I agree that like the sliders are sort of not
Yeah.
too relevant for that kind of thing.
That sounds good. I mean, I was more than
Yeah.
happy to drop them because that's like clearly an issue.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure it wasn't exactly as you said, like a sign of an issue with the sim logic in general. It's affecting everything else. So I just wanted to like flag that. But yeah, so in the initial stuff, I just dropped that. The second data issue that I was seeing was that there was some like insanely high ROI builds that were in there, and all of them had sim precision set to 0 in that sim. So like that's clearly all we're talking like 500,000% ROI returns.
Yeah.
Like think probability above 30. So like there clearly was something wrong there. And it's funny, I right when I dropped sim precision 0 from all the builds, like they came back down to earth pretty much like across the board. So that was also something that like I'm not exactly sure because parts of this process is like a bit of a black box on my end in terms of like the sim logic. So I just wanted to like bring that to your guys' attention and think, is there a logical reason as to why a sim precision 0 would be causing this, or is it like an issue with the data?
Yeah. We talked about this a little bit the other day. So like there is a meaningful difference between sim precision 0 and sim precision 1 compared to like 1 to 2, because at 0 you're running like true optimals. We're using just like the mean projections that you see on the site and not doing anything with like the sims. And I think that I haven't looked completely, but I think that there's like some different ways that the builder works when sim precision is at 0. Like we force like this for high sim precision, like we don't actually force like each lineup has to be unique. We just sort of like, if there are duplicates, we ignore them, just for like speed, because like a normal optimizer, it's like, okay, like once you build one lineup, then you have to do a constraint that the second lineup can't be the same as the first. For like sim precision above 0, we don't really need to do that much because there's like enough randomness. That could be what, but basically, long story short, is like sim precision at 0 is like we're using all 5,000 sims or whatever. Sim precision 1, we're like it's a far smaller number of sims, but like it's still, I wouldn't expect it to be a huge difference in ROI. And obviously something like 500,000, I mean, that's just like, it doesn't make any sense. I'm not even sure that's like
it's impossible,
actually possible.
But
so like that seems to be clearly like a bug. But I think it is weird that we're not seeing that with any other
Yeah, that is weird to
build
me.
settings. Have you looked into like any of the builds where that happened, like the Simposition Zero builds, and like looked at the lineups at all?
Not the lineups. I looked at what like kind of contests they were in just to see like if
Yeah.
something was weird with the contest, and it seemed like a normal contest. It was just like a
Mhm.
mid-sized GPP that had like the highest one possible. So I'm happy to like look into those lineups and kind of see what the deal is there. Is it possible like that it's you multiple winning lineups, or was that accounted for in the Sims? Like, is it possible you have 5 lineups that are the same that all win first place, or
Yeah, so like, I mean, the way that this is working is that each lineup is treated independently.
yeah,
So we're not measuring like if you entered all 500 of these lineups, what would you win? We're saying like if you entered each lineup separately, like what's the
yeah,
ROI of each lineup independently, and then
sure.
just like what's the average of all those ROIs.
Is it
So,
possible 500 of them bink? Then is it possible that like I don't know, could that make an ROI that's like insane, or is that
but
accounted
they
for?
wouldn't bink like if
Yeah, I'm saying
in a
500
big
the same
contest,
lineup.
like even if you have like the perfect projections, like
Yeah.
you're not going to have an ROI that's like
Okay.
that high. Like obviously we've talked before about like the sim bias where we're building
Yeah.
lineups using our projections and then we're evaluating them also using our
Yeah.
our sims, and so there's going to be that bias there. But to get like that would be every lineup is like binking every single sim is
Yeah.
what so that's which seems to be maybe, I mean it could be like that accented character thing where like if we're saying like every entry in the contest has like missing
Yeah.
slots
Then makes sense.
and our lineups don't, and so it's like, okay, well if you're playing against people that only get 6 players and we get 9,
Yeah.
then yeah, we're gonna like bink a
Yeah.
large percentage of the time.
Yeah.
So like
That should be
that's probably like my best theory, but it
okay.
doesn't make sense that Simposition Zero would be
Yeah.
so much different than the
Interesting.
others. Maybe slightly better because again you're taking full advantage of that
Mhm.
advantage.
But
But like what you're saying is like at Simposition Zero it was like 500,000% ROI, and then at
yeah.
Simposition One it was like 200% or something,
Like,
right?
yeah,
Like
there's some like outliers still when I dropped the Simpsons, but not nearly as many as like when I
right,
had that in there.
yeah.
So yeah, that was like definitely like a weird thing in there. So I'm happy to like look at that contest
Do
with
you,
the highest ROI and
yeah.
yeah, see the lineups.
Do you have like just I know you said you maybe didn't have the data, but like I'm just curious if you have any examples of like like I was maybe just gonna bring it up in the database and just see really quickly if like we have those
Like a really high, like you're saying,
issues.
like the one that was really
Yeah, one of
high.
those ones. Yeah, either like the build or the contest. I just want to like really quickly check like is there something obvious that sticks out with those? But if you don't have it available, we can kind of um, troubleshoot it after.
Sure. So I think my Wi-Fi cut out there for a second, but let me run. I could just give you like a contest ID if that's
Yeah, if you
easier.
want to just like DM me,
Yeah, I
and then
will.
I'll look it up. But
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, do you have any thoughts, Jordan, on this
Yeah.
stuff? Or
Well, one thing I was thinking of, I don't think this explains this, but it kind of popped into my head as we were talking about it, is are we like controlling for like a late swap bias? Like if in the real contests, like some pitcher that 80% of the field rostered got scratched after lock and nobody was able to swap out of that, like
yeah,
if
we're not
we're
controlling for
not, so
that.
if we build lineups after the fact with that information, like that was one thing, that was the first thing that popped in my head, is like especially on really low sim precision, if it was on a specific slate where there was like a scratch that nobody really got the opportunity to react to at low sim precision, you would have like in theory like the perfect optimals to kind of account for that.
Yeah, we're not accounting for that. So like those,
Mhm.
yeah, those are going to be.
That's just kind of like a bias almost that we have to.
Yeah, like I remember last year there was like a game where DeGrom was pitching and the Mets got postponed,
Yeah.
and it was like not expected to be postponed. and like I think he was something like 75% owned.
Right.
So like that's, in that situation, the builds would have 0 DeGrom because he's out, but all the builds, not just in position 0, would have none of him.
Yeah.
Right.
Um,
And it still
obviously
doesn't
at-
explain 500,000% ROI either, like, or whatever.
Yeah.
It is.
So like, yeah, I'm just looking at this one that you sent me, Elijah, and it's like, yeah, it doesn't have that like accented name issue.
Okay.
It looks like this contest that you sent me.
Yeah.
So this is like the quarter jukebox on, it looks like June 4th. Let me just bring up this slate real quick.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, so this was the DraftKings main slate. It was a 4-game slate on June 4th. And it's like some quarter jukebox. And yeah, I don't see anything obvious. Do you happen to have like the build ID for like one of those like 500,000
Yeah.
ROI? I just want to see if like, because I'm wondering if it's like for some reason the build failed and it only built one lineup.
Yeah, it's possible.
And so it's like
see.
that one lineup for some, but like even still, it doesn't like one lineup
Yeah.
wouldn't have that ROI. But like that's the kind of thing that I could see.
So I have, let me see here. I don't have the build ID. I have like the build settings, but it's just the way I was downloading them from the cloud. I couldn't pull in like the ID from the file name.
Got it. Okay.
But
No worries.
I
That's fine.
have, yeah, and there's actually a few. There's a few builds that all are like above 500,000 here is what I'm saying. Not
Yeah.
just like the highest one. There's like every time precision is 0, it's like well above like an astronomical return. So there's something weird here.
Yeah.
And then like I'm seeing a precision 10, I'm seeing 100% ROI. Like that's still high, but like it's so yeah. And as you were saying before, like there is that bias.
Yeah,
of the model.
that ROI is like
Like-
that's kind of what I would expect.
Exactly.
Like that's what we were seeing is like, yeah, okay, I mean, I would expect that SaberSim lineups in general have a positive ROI.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you're only evaluating them using our sims, then they're going to have a much higher expected ROI. So I think 100% seems like reasonable given that we're using our sims to evaluate. Obviously,
Yeah.
like that wouldn't be the actual true expected ROI.
Yeah.
But
No, I just wanted to like
Yeah.
give context there because like okay, even once I dropped for all of those and whatever, and I looked at the optimal settings for each build, like the mean ROI is ranged from like 50 to like 300%, which like don't make sense, but there's not 500,000. So like that was like a range that I thought was more like logical there. Just to give like some background on like the relative numbers that we're looking for.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm kind of like just quickly looking to see if there's anything that comes up, but I think probably what we should do is just like let's move on. So basically, to summarize, like we need to look into these two. So the two issues are like the negative 100 ROI and some of these 4-mans, which again we can ignore those for the analysis, but like we should just make sure that it's not affecting other, like maybe these two issues are related somehow. And then obviously the other thing is the sim precision 0 having sometimes these like crazy high numbers. My just guess is that it's something about like the builds are not completing. Either they're like only building like a handful of lineups and for some reason that's like leading to this like these crazy numbers, or they're like building a ton of lineups. But again, we're just gonna have to dig into like some specific examples and see. I think it makes sense to just ignore, like we should just ignore anything that probably the sim position 0, but also anything that's like above 500% ROI. Like
That's
just ignore that, and because clear like that probably means there's some issue with the data. But obviously, like before we do anything actionable here, we need to like make sure that whatever is causing those bugs isn't also affecting the rest of the analysis. We don't want to like change all these settings and then be like, oh, actually we were like we had some bug that was like ignoring half of the entries or like whatever. So but we can kind of
That
move
sounds
on. Like, if you want to just talk a little bit about, I know you have incomplete data and there's these issues, but do you want to just talk a little bit about like what you found in the data that looks legitimate?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to like start talking about that and maybe like open up like ideas for like alternative processes to do this.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
like, so it's funny you say five. It's exactly the threshold I chose was 500%. I was like, anything below that. I plotted like a basic histogram of the ROIs across the whole thing, and I saw a major dip around 500%. So that seemed like it was an outlier point that I can like include in the data. And yeah, I dropped anything that was negative 100%, because obviously there are going to be sims with negative percentage, even though we're using our own sims. But I thought everything that was negative 100, I also dropped. So those are
Yeah.
the three things I filtered for: precision not being 0, ROI being less than 500 but greater than negative 100. So my initial just like basic analysis would be to group this data by bucket and see what the best settings were for each bucket. And quite frankly, I did that, and I'm looking at it, and there's not like an immediately obvious trend in terms of like, as the contests get bigger, it's better to have ownership higher. Like, so I'm not seeing that in this data, which makes me wonder if there's like too many errors in it to draw some sort of conclusions from it. What is interesting, like something that did stand out to me, is that across all buckets, sim precision is within the 5 to 7 range, which I thought was interesting. There's no like, again, this data could be total noise, but what I'm seeing is that sim precision is pretty much always in the 5 to 7 range for the optimal, and that ranges from the smallest bucket to 50,000 size GPPs. Interesting. I don't know if that like sparks anything to you guys. I dug into also to see just like some background on like how this process like works. Is for each bucket we look at each possible build setting, right? But obviously some buckets are going to be a lot more populated than others in the data set. Like there may only be 1 or 2 huge GPPs that are in my data. So if you say, okay, like these are the best settings, it's possible at just one contest we hit really well on, and that's not sustainable in terms of build settings. That could just be like on one slate we got it really right and like we did well, but that's not like a long-term optimal build strategy. So I looked at like the sample size of some of these buckets, and some of them are only like 3 or 4 contests in there. So I thought that's like a little bit concerning to me. Yeah.
I have a question. The ownership numbers that we're using here, where are they from? Like, are they, because I know we've made a lot of changes to the ownership model like throughout this past year. Are we just grabbing the ownership projections as they were that day, or
you mean for like the ownership fade slider?
Yeah.
It's as they were. I mean, so we're only doing slates that I think are from like June or later, I believe. I know we made some updates this month, but I think like I need to look up the date, but I think we like our ownership projections were we made a pretty big fix, like I thought in May, which is why I chose June. But I know like Eric kind of made another update to optimize them further like a few weeks ago. So like they're going to be best this month, but I think that they're still like.
Are they the aggregated? They're based on the aggregates, right? That was the main thing I was wondering, because I thought that would make sense if we were using basically like our SaberSim optimal ownership projections, that we might find that the ownership fade is basically just like noisy, that we don't really get anything out of it. But if it's aggregated ownership projections, I feel like it's a little bit more reliable then.
No, I think that they're good ownership. It's not just the SaberSim. Yeah, because if it's SaberSim, if it's like ownership that's just based on our projections, then it's like the more ownership fade is like you're literally just fading our sims, which is like, you get into weird territory there, depending on like how popular our projections would be in the field, or like how close they are to other sources, other projection sources. So the 5 to 7 variance thing is kind of interesting. I mean, I can explain, like I can find reasons why that would be.
Yeah.
Like as you're thinking about variance, like at really low, it's kind of just looking at like you're not really taking advantage of the sims at all. You're just sort of like using projections or like a little bit of randomness, but like you're not really getting any of that like correlation of from sim precision where it's like you take these buckets and like if the pitcher goes up, the opposing team kind of goes down, and like this aggregates. I'm like looking at, so like 5 is 28 sims per lineup, 6 is 18 sims per lineup, and 7 is 11 sims per lineup. So it makes sense, like when you get really high sim precision, it's just so much randomness that, especially for MLB, where you don't need like that perfect sim optimal to bank. And so it makes sense to me logically that like, okay, yeah, you don't want it to be that high because then it's just like too much randomness and you're just like losing the rake basically, because you're just like kind of, there's just too much and you don't need that much. At too low, you're not really taking advantage of the sim. So like I can kind of see it. It does seem a little bit weird that it is like for every bucket that seems to be the range. I would expect like 2-game slates, would like have higher. Are you differentiating by the slate size? Or
no, not yet. That's like
okay.
not yet. I feel like once I saw
so maybe
the data,
so maybe that would be something else to look at, because my intuition is that like the slate size is maybe the bigger impact on the optimal sim precision than like the contest size.
Sure.
But
maybe that
I could be wrong there. I don't know.
No, that's definitely something that's like a next step to look into.
I think if there were like MLB contests that were like 200,000 entrants, like if there's like a Millie Maker type contest for MLB, I think I would expect that higher sim precision would be a little bit higher ROI. But again, that's just like, I don't have the data to support that. That's why we're doing this. So I could be wrong.
It would not surprise me, though. I would say, like, even at the end of this, if we find something like, so obviously zero sim precision has to exist because you need that for cash builds. But it wouldn't surprise me if we found something like sim precision 1, 2, 3, and 4 are basically never optimal. Like there is no contest type where it actually makes sense to use that kind of bucketing.
Yeah, I agree, because you're not really getting any value of the sims there. You're just like kind of adding a little bit. It's like going to a traditional optimizer and adding like 10% randomness. It's like, okay, what's even the point of doing that? Like you might as well just like not have randomness and just like do uniques or something. Like there's not really like a point to just adding like a tiny amount of randomness to build. So it's like either use like sim randomness or use none at all.
So it's funny you said, Jordan. I actually did, because I was curious, look also what are the worst performing builds for each bucket, and almost exclusively they all have precision 1 and 2, which I thought was interesting. One of them has like an 8, but like 1 and 2, like 90% of them are 1 and 2. So like that is interesting that you mentioned that, because like, so that makes me think maybe this data is good enough to tell a story that's not out of whack.
That's kind of where my head was going with some of this, of like maybe we find that not only do we reset the optimal sliders, but we actually kind of like rescale them. Like if we find that sim precision 5 through 10 are the only really usable categories, we could do something like you could turn it off, but if it's on, then your new 1 through 10 is actually our current 5 through 10, and you have more discrete values available or something
so like
that.
You start at 30 sims as the bucket, and then it's like, rather than being between, because like right now sim precision 1 is 125 sims per lineup, which obviously that's like way less than 5,000, which is 0. But like I think 100 plus sims is like enough where you're not really getting too much range. When you think about like the average of 100 different sims, it's like, it's probably going to be like pretty small standard deviation. So I could definitely see an argument for just going between like 1 and 30 basically for like the 10 different sim precision buckets, and then you just have way more I mean, we'd have to make sure that we tell people about that, because then like
Right.
their sim position 7 no longer means the same thing. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. So I guess like maybe this shows like there are issues with the upper percentiles of our data, but maybe like the ones that don't win big actually like have meaningful data in there, which maybe is something we can like use to our advantage.
Of the contest sims.
Yeah, I'm saying the content. Like it seems like maybe like the lineups that aren't insanely, out of whack actually are telling a story.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I was hoping like,
I'm not
I was hopeful that
surprised,
it wasn't
but-
just like everything was like completely
Yeah.
broken. And yeah, this does. It's good to see some intuitive results from this. So it's like, okay, we've got stuff to work with. Clearly, there's like something that's up with some of them, but I think it sounds like, and then I don't. Sorry if I missed this, but did you talk about correlation at all with?
So let me look at in terms of the top performing correlations. I don't know. I think it seems like stuff's out of whack. So for the contest bucket 1, which is a 10% or fewer single entry GPP, it's showing me a correlation of 10 is like the most optimal. And that number kind of bounced around from 2 to 6 for like as the contests get bigger. But there's no clear relationship, which is what I was kind of looking for, of like as the contests buckets get bigger, there's some sort of trend there, and I wasn't seeing that. But
yeah, I mean, I think that like honestly, I would almost just like ignore contests less than 100 entrants for this. Like, I think that there's just going to be like weirdness with like these smaller contests where like, it's just there's not enough entries to like really do this analysis well with the sliders. Obviously, like 10 correlation being optimal seems weird, but there's probably something about like, oh, when you set 10 correlation, it's like it's like we're probably like measuring the not the same effect that we want. Like we're measuring something else really that like is optimal about those contests. That correlation is doing.
That doesn't even sound that off to me either. Like especially if we're, well, I guess we're looking at all slates. I don't know. Like if you were playing a 10-man tonight, 13 games, like correlation 10, and basically just hope that you get like the right 2 teams, and that like a 5-3 stack of the 2 best teams is optimal. I don't know. That actually like kind of checks out for me, but
yeah.
So I just dropped all contests under 100 and reran it, and like I'm seeing a much more like I'm seeing correlation at 4, 3, 5, like pretty much across the board.
Okay.
So nothing like weird there.
Yeah, I mean that is interesting though, because like, our current defaults are generally like for MLB is like 8 for big slates.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything above 5.
I'm not like shocked that the optimal is less than what we have now. I think it's interesting. Obviously, like the common heuristic is like build big stacks for MLB. I think there's good reason for that, but like I think you still do get stacks when you have correlation like 4 to 6, and I could see the argument for like you're getting, if you have smaller stacks, you can just like get better combinations of players that like projects better. So I don't know, that's like kind of surprising, but I don't think that's not like a red flag to me that those are the optimal. That like a mid-range correlation is like better, but I don't know. What do you think, Jordan? Like, does that sound weird to you?
Okay, so I just ran one at 4. I ran a build at like 407, and I mean the lineups are still pretty good stacks. 5-2, 5. You do get like some like 3-2s, like 3-3-2s and 4-2s. Like, so it doesn't seem that bad to me. There is like a little bit of a red flag for me in that, like, I wonder if our sim bias is devaluing correlation a little bit, since like we're grading the test with the same thing that we're building the lineups, that it's like, well, like you might as well build the 3-2 lineup and not totally correlate if you know what's going to happen.
If you know your sims are perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Like I could see that pushing correlation down a little.
Mm.
So
I ran another method of looking at the optimal builds just based on this data issue we were having. I thought maybe it'd be like a better way to look at it. I think Matt, I was trying to explain this to you. It was a little bit complicated, but I thought it was like a good way to handle the like odd cases of really high performances, even in like the 300 to 500 range. And then in this method, I am seeing correlation slowly increase as the contests get bigger, and I'm seeing sim precision slowly decrease as the contest size get bigger. And I can tell you kind of how I did it this way. But so what I did here, Matt, it's a little bit. If this doesn't make sense, just stop me. But like, so for each contest bucket, we have like 2,000 whatever builds are, or whatever. Okay, so for each contest, like for each individual build line, I looked at what is the 90th percentile ROI, like for all of the builds for contest bucket 4, whatever. What's the 90th percentile ROI? I then looked at all the builds that fall in that ROI, and then just took the average of what their settings were. So like the suggestions I'm seeing here are like 4.5, 4.7, because it's an average of all of the builds that were a member of a top 90th percentile ROI. Does that make sense or no? Did you follow that?
So you're saying the 90th percentile ROI, what you're saying is like, yeah, so like of all the 2,000 builds, you have all of their average ROI, and then you're just isolating the top 10%.
Exactly. So I'm looking at the top 10% for let's say for one bucket, for bucket 10, out of all the data, what were the top 10% builds out of all the data? And then I collapsed those builds into just like take the mean of their settings and said, this is like this was the average of the top 10% performing builds.
Right. So yeah, I definitely right. I like that in terms of you're taking away some of the variance basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, an individual build is like, you might have like some random build that just for whatever reason does super well in these sims, but yeah, we want to like take a bigger. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. I mean, I think the weirdness of doing like the average of the settings is that they're like not independent. Like correlation and sim precision are like correlation 8 at sim precision 4 is a lot different than correlation 8 at sim precision 10, because it's like the actual fantasy points for each player is like higher variance, and so the correlation ends up like mattering less. Like the lower the sim precision, the more that correlation and ownership impact the lineups, I think. Is how I've always thought of it. So, but I do think that this is like, that's a valuable approach. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting approach for sure.
I just thought because there's probably, what if there's one contest you were saying that did really well, and so that build is taking all the credit for it, whereas like the second place build is extremely different numbers. I wanted a way to encapsulate that. So I try, and in these numbers, I'm seeing correlations sort of start at 5 and go up to 6.7 in terms of the contests get bigger. And I'm seeing sim precision start at 5 and kind of go down to 4 as the contests get bigger. So like there's clearly some sort of trend there, but I'm not. Yeah, as you said, I wasn't thinking about the dependence of the variables.
No, but I think that's a really good approach to see, especially just to see the trends. Like that's a lot more encouraging to me to hear. Like like that makes sense. Correlation goes up as contests get bigger. Precision goes down as contests get bigger. Well, actually, no. Precision should go up as contests get bigger, is what I would think.
It kind of hops around, but the trend of what I'm seeing is it sort of goes down. And ownership is pretty flat, which was surprising to me. I don't know if that means anything to you guys.
It's flat at what? What is it flat at?
At exactly 5. It goes from like 4.98 to 5.01, like pretty much like across the board. That's like, it's like very flat, which I thought was interesting as well. But yeah. So that was the kind of the 2 ways I was thinking of doing it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, obviously this isn't like the final numbers. We're just sort of like talking through this. What I would, so like just thinking about, well, I guess, do you have any like thoughts? It sounds like you wanted to bring something up, Jordan. I was just gonna think about like next steps here.
So I have a couple. So I mean, one, I do think since we're not really adjusting for slate size yet, we're like kind of just looking at like baseball average sliders, which is like a little weird. Like it would make sense to me if without adjusting for slate size, if we just have an average ownership fade of like 5, and that optimal number on 3-game slates is actually 8, and on 14-game slates it's actually 3, and just everything coming out in the wash is like roughly 5. I also think that we are going to have to like, there's going to be an interesting point here where we have to challenge some assumptions of what happens to these things as different variables change. Because like, I think correlation as a slate size gets bigger, or as the contest size gets bigger or smaller, is a really weird one. Like I think it makes some sense that correlation would want to increase up to a certain point. But if you were playing against like 200,000 lineups, like somebody's probably going to have the nuts. And then all of a sudden it's like, do you need to back off of it a little bit? Like I could see correlation
it's
peaking.
not linear. It's
exactly.
Kind of like a bell curve. Yeah.
And I wouldn't also even be surprised to see that some of these other things are like that as well.
Yeah. I mean, my intuition is that like small contests, you want low, like very small contests, you want low-ish correlation, low sim precision, low ownership. At medium-sized contests, you want like high correlation, medium high sim precision, and at super big like if there was theoretically 200,000, you would want lowish correlation, super high sim precision. You know, like correlation kind of as a bell curve, and sim precision just like goes up as the contest gets bigger. Is like what I would kind of expect, but I don't know.
And when we build these, we're like grading all 1,500 lineups. Is it 1,500? Okay.
No, it's 500.
It's 500.
Like the default.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's also. Yeah. I guess that's all I have right now. But.
Yeah. So what I would say, so I think in terms of next steps, we'll have to figure out those bugs. So what I would do, Elijah, is like pull up some examples of like the contests and the builds that like have those with the negative 100% ROI and like the super high ROI, and we can just sort of like maybe we can just jump on a call and like walk through them together and just see like if something obvious jumping out, we can like rerun the contest sim and just see like maybe there's some, it was like an old run of the contest sim, and like when we run it again, it's like totally normal results, and that means we just need to like rerun everything. I don't know. But we should like dig into those specific examples just to make sure there's not some like issue that's affecting other things. And then after that, like once we feel comfortable with like the data, then it's like download everything, and then let's split it up by slate size as well.
Sounds good.
And like basically do the same analysis, but like I would almost say like rather than having slate size as a, like we should basically just analyze each like slate size bucket independently, or maybe not independently, but I don't know. I mean, I think that there's like a meaningful difference between a 2-game slate and a 4-game slate, but not between like a 10-game and a 13-game. So I feel like maybe it's like, I would say like basically treat like 2 through 6 as like each its own bucket, and then maybe like 7 through 9, and then like 10 plus. That I mean, we can like get more. I think it partly depends on how many slates we have for each.
That's the issue. But I see us falling into a just like sample size problem here, because like even some of these buckets now, I'm seeing like 3 or 4 contests in our data set that are in them. So like, I guess it'll tell a different story when I download all of it, but because now we're gonna split into 3 additional buckets. It's gonna be like,
right. But like some of the buckets just aren't like, frankly, aren't that important. You know, like so it's okay if we don't have a ton of like, what we care about are like the most common contest types, and like you already did that analysis to see like what are the most common contest buckets, and so like we should really focus on those. And then I think like the trends I think will be obvious. Like once we've kind of narrowed down like, okay, what are the optimal sliders for those, then we can sort of like figure out, do we want to like use the exact findings from this analysis for the other buckets, or do we want to just see like those trends and just sort of like adjust, like kind of smooth out the curve,
Yeah,
so to speak?
these are, yeah. I think it's useful to have both. Yeah, to have both like ways of showing the build settings. So yeah, I'll yeah, sounds good.
Cool. Yeah. I think that all makes sense. Yeah. So like, again, so for the slate size bucket, like basically smaller buckets for like the number of games, like for the smaller ones, just because I think there's like intuitively, I think there's a big difference between those smaller slates, whereas like the big ones, I think we can probably just like bundle all of like the big like 10+ game slates together.
Sure.
I don't see there being a meaningful difference. But if there's like a really big sample of those, if we have like 20 or whatever slates that are 10+ games, then we can maybe split them up more. But
yeah,
I'm guessing we won't have that because we only have like 30 something slates overall. So
I'll start with these 3 buckets, and then we'll see like what it looks like from there in terms of 2 to 6, 7 to 9, and 10+. And we'll see what that looks like.
Yeah. Cool. Sounds good.
Sweet.
Anything you want to add, Jordan?
No, it's exciting. I mean, the sliders are like so fundamentally SaberSim, it feels like to me, that I think it's like kind of cool that we're getting an opportunity to kind of check them and see. So
yeah. All right. Cool. Well, thanks, guys.
All right. Cool. Thanks.
Talk to you later.
All right, guys.